Melissa, it's great to have you, and tell us what you think the child tax credit really is all about.
So what I think makes this policy expansion both politically and economically feasible and generally very good policy is the fact that it's targeted on families with children. So it's not universal in the sense that every adult, every able-bodied adult gets this payment. We're giving this money to families with children. And frankly, this is one of the best ways the federal government can and should be spending money from the perspective of social returns. We have tons of evidence showing that helping families with kids pay their bills, supplementing their income, this leads to beneficial effects for kids that last into adulthood, improving their education and economic outcomes. So the fact that this is targeted on families with kids is precisely why I think this is good economic policy.
Well, and it doesn't, frankly, compared with the trillions of dollars in stimulus programs we've been used to over the past year and a half, it's not that expensive. We're talking about $150 billion over a 12-month period of time. I guess my question, though, is what kind of confusion it could engender. So on the lower income side of things, a lot of families who don't even pay any tax, they get it. No strings attached. That's why we call it refundable. But once you start moving into the middle income areas, it offsets sort of the tax refund, doesn't it? I mean, you have people who advise, tax advisors saying they think parents should opt out because it could mess with the refunds they might get next spring. So in other words, in those cases, apparently 1 million families have already opted out of 35 million or so. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. So if we want to help families with children, doing it through the tax code is a really complicated, cumbersome way to do it. Our tax code is extremely complicated, and the lowest income families, so families who most need income assistance, generally don't file taxes. So I think this expansion that happened quickly in the COVID pandemic, policy era, this sets up a child allowance idea. But ideally, going forward, we would pull this out of the tax code and just have a child allowance, a child benefit program. It could be run through the Social Security Agency, which is already in the business of sending out checks every month to retirees. We could have a streamlined spending program that we could commit to in the federal budget. And then families wouldn't have to do this really complicated dance of figuring out how this affects their overall tax credit,
exactly.
Wondering whether they're going to get this check just to have to pay it back. And just as you said.
Again, I think it's going to be a long, long time before we see the results of it. We know about the efficacy. We can change how to better target it or what have you. But is this all meant to be sort of an entry point into a universal basic income for all Americans? And we should add that, as I was kind of discussing before, I think the idea of UBI started out as something that would replace existing entitlements. I think we all know that would never be the case today. Social Security is not going anywhere. Medicare is not going anywhere. This would just be additional stimulus payments to the population that doesn't yet qualify for those entitlements, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. An actual universal basic income that paid anything like, let's say, $10,000, right, or even $8,000 to every adult a year, that would swamp the federal budget. So you couldn't do that and maintain Social Security, Medicare, disability insurance, housing assistance, the earned income tax credit. Now, something like this, universal child allowance, and in this sense, maybe we would call it universal because it's going to essentially 90% of families. So this could be reasonably considered a precursor to a child allowance, which we could afford without cutting all of our other spending, entitlement, social insurance programs. It's, $100 billion a year, $120 billion a year. That is, comparable to other spending programs. And frankly, it's something that if we committed to this type of a child allowance, we could have we could raise taxes in ways that could cover that without upending all of our existing social insurance programs, which essentially would be required for an actual universal basic income not targeted on children.
It's fascinating. Universal child income is your term, the way that you're describing it. Melissa, thanks so much. Again, a pretty historic day here